just a little bit about the Ten Commandments because this is such an important part of Scripture, one that we're very familiar with, one that continues to be talked about a lot in our culture, and one that's just very important for understanding the nature of the Old Testament. I want to focus on a few things. One, what the Ten Commandments are, kind of a little bit about the tradition of the Ten Commandments, in particular, how we count them, and then also just ask the question of how do these intersect with Israel's story, which is one of the themes that we've been looking at from this unit. So let's take a look at the Ten Commandments and just take a look at where they come from. First, let's look at the two passages where we have the Ten Commandments. One's Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. That's the one that we're going to do most of our work in. But I do just want to make sure that you guys are aware that in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 6 through 21, we have an almost identical retelling of the Ten Commandments. And we'll talk more about that when we get to Deuteronomy, about the nature in which Deuteronomy is a retelling of the Ten Commandments. So let's take a look at these. Let's start with what are the Ten Commandments. So we're going to look at a pretty popular summary of the Ten Commandments list. And when we're looking at that, we're going to go to this mode like this so that we can see them kind of in a tablet view. So let's look here. So we're in Exodus chapter 20. Note that the beginning of the Ten Commandments, I'm the Lord your God, just seeing how this works in the text. We see Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, and God spoke these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So in our tradition, this is kind of the broad Protestant tradition here. This is the preamble to the Ten Commandments. So I'm the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. We'll talk about that more in a moment. I think from a literary perspective, that's likely the best way to read that. And then we go through our commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, here a carved image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness, and you shall not covet. Let's point out just a couple of things. One is, as we said, we've made this decision that Exodus chapter 20, verse 2 really belongs as a preamble. We'll talk about that more in a moment. I think based on some ancient Near Eastern literature, that's a pretty good decision. But let's look at this one for a moment. Look at Exodus chapter 20, verses 3, 4, and 5. Now, I do want us to see that it does seem fairly obvious that you shall have no other gods before me, you shall not make for yourself a carved image. Those seem to go together. And so for that reason, there's traditions, we'll look at some in a moment, that take Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 through 5 as one commandment, all the verses together forbidding idolatry of any kind. So then that would ask, well, do those traditions not have 10 commandments? Answer is, yeah, they do. So let's see how. So let's look at some of the other ways that the 10 commandments can be counted. So again, we take verse 2, that's the preamble. That leaves us with 10 commandments as long as we take verse 3 and make that separate from verses 4 and 5, even though those verses do seem to be explaining something very similar. So let's look at the Jewish tradition. So the Jewish tradition is going to take these commandments, what we would have as commandment number 1 and number 2, and it's going to combine them. So you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. Those go together. However, what happens is that what we take as the preamble comes into Jewish tradition as one of the commandments. Now, one of the things we might say is that's not actually a commandment. And that's true. So in Jewish tradition, this is one of the reasons these are called the 10 words and not the 10 commandments. That makes more sense when we look at the text and see that God spoke all of these words. The Hebrew word here is devar. So God spoke these words to his people. So it's an understanding of God spoke 10 words. The first being, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Then you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. And then after that, the list is going to follow what our list would once we pick up at commandment number 3, even though there's been a change to both 1 and 2. That's Jewish tradition. Now, Catholic tradition is different still. So let's look at Catholic tradition. So in Catholic tradition, we're going to have, I'm the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. So it's actually taking in Catholic tradition everything that happens in verses 2 all the way through 5 and it's combining them together. I say, wow, okay, so this is really going to be a problem because you're going to end up with 9 commandments. Just to be clear again, the Jewish tradition breaks these into 2 commandments, bringing what we're calling the preamble in the Protestant tradition down into a commandment, and that's the reason that they can combine what in our tradition is commandment number 2 and commandment number 3. In our tradition, we have the preamble up here with these separated, so we still get 10 commandments. So what is the Catholic tradition going to do? Well, they're going to come at the very end of the commandment list, and they are going to see in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. So where we would take that and say, well, you shall not covet, generally, the Catholic tradition is going to, and the Lutheran tradition as well, is instead going to say you shall not covet your neighbor's house or your neighbor's stuff, including your neighbor's wife. So you see there that the commandments have been counted differently. That does interpret the way that we, or does affect the way that we interpret the commandments. But let's talk briefly and just understand some things about the nature of the 10 Commandments. And I'm going to make an argument that of all 3 of these, our tradition, what here is called the Reformed Anglican Orthodox, I would just say more broadly the Protestant tradition, though Eastern Orthodox and the Orthodox Communion would see this tradition as well. I'm going to make the argument that I think this is the best way to count the commandments. So I am going to admit that I do think that verse 3 is largely explained by verses 4 and 5. So I'm not upset when people count that as one commandment, but I do think that we can see a clear distinction there, especially in the way that we practice the commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. Okay, well, that means that even if I'm not making a carved image, I still have no other gods before my God. And that's something that as we talk more about idolatry in this class, we'll see that idolatry is not just making an image. False worship is not just making an image. So I think it's helpful for us to see that command broken up. What I think is definitely the case, though, is this statement right here, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's what we would call a preamble here, and this is common in the ancient Near East. If you look at other ancient Near Eastern cultures, and you look at the covenants that they would often make, the treaties they would often make, is that typically these covenants would be between what we would call a lord and then a vassal. So the Lord, very clearly here, is in the place of God. This would have been in ancient Near Eastern world when these were made in a human-to-human context. The Lord would have been someone who owned land or who had a lot of power, maybe a king. The vassal would have been someone who is pledging themselves to be his servant, receiving the protection of the Lord, but then also pledging themselves to obey his conditions. And so what would happen is there would be some type of preamble saying something like, I'm the one who has conquered the surrounding territory, or I am the one who has the ability to provide for my vassals, something like that. So here what you have is God saying, I am Yahweh your God. Remember when we see capital L-O-R-D, that's the divine name, Yahweh. So I am Yahweh your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So God is saying in the preamble, this is the sort of God that you're in covenant with. That reminds us then that this comes in the context of a story. Exodus 20 is not just a random group of rules, but instead the sort of God who redeems his people, the sort of God who established a covenant with Abraham, now deepens that covenant by saying, as my people already loved, already established in a covenant because you're children of Abraham, already delivered from your captors in Egypt. So far, nothing's been asked of them. And now God says, as my people, I am going to call you to behave in this way, and then gives the 10 Commandments. Let me look at one of the only, in fact, the only major difference between the 10 Commandments and Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. I'm going to pull up this document here. And all I want us to look at here is this bit here. So this chart right here. And so this is from a paper that I did for a conference, but I just want us to look at the commandment for Sabbath. So as we look at the Sabbath commandment, as we go back over to the text, we see in verse 8 a command to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So as we receive that commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, then there's an explanation given. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So notice that this is one of our commandments that has a therefore statement on it. So remember the Sabbath day. Why? For this reason. So let's look at that. Well, that connects this to Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, where we're told that God completed the heavens and the earth and all their host. And on the seventh day, God completed all the work that he did. So on the seventh day, he ceased from all the work that he did, and God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. You guys will just see through my highlights here that there's all of this this coordination, these parallels between these passages, because on it, God ceased from all the work he created, which he had been doing. All right, so I want us to see there then that's Exodus 20, clearly tying Sabbath to God's creative practice. So the celebration of Sabbath and the Ten Commandments is commanded so that God's people would image God, reflect God, saying that just as God rested from his work in creation, not because he was tired, but instead to enjoy the fruit of his labor, so humanity should honor God by remembering the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So on the Sabbath day, what are God's people called to do? To cease from their labors and enjoy the fruit of their labor and enjoy the community that they have with God and God has with them. That's Exodus 20. But then in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15, after an identical commandment, remember the Sabbath day, because we're told, I'm sorry, and it's not identical. So we look at Deuteronomy chapter 5:14, what we're going to see is a different verb. So on verse 12, observe the Sabbath day. So another way we might say that is to keep the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. And then we have something similar. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to Yahweh your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your ox, your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. And then we have a different purpose for keeping the Sabbath. Now, it's not a contradictory purpose, but it's a different one. What's that purpose? Well, let's go back and let's look here at verse 15. So remember, because you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God caused you to go out from there by a strong hand and reaching arm, therefore Yahweh your God commanded you to make the Sabbath day. What this is showing us is, again, the commandments make sense when read within the context of Israel's story. So in keeping the Sabbath, it's not just some random thing that Israel does, not just a rule to follow, but instead they are both proclaiming God's creative activity in creation. So we are the people whose God is the God who is the creator, who has given us what we need and who rested in his creation to enjoy the fruit of his work. Therefore, we rest in the work that God has given us to do and the provision God has given us from that work. And these are the people who keep Sabbath because God has delivered them out of Egypt. And therefore, they also give rest to the sojourners and the servants and the slaves in their own community. And it's a proclamation of the fact that not only are we a people who are created people who are in rest and community with Yahweh, but we are a people who Yahweh has delivered. So our celebration of Sabbath also reflects the deliverance of Yahweh. So as we close, I hope you guys see how even the Ten Commandments are connected to Israel's story and the Sabbath in particular. One last thing that I would just encourage you with on the Sabbath is that often in our culture, and I mean our Christian culture, I don't just mean our broader culture. If we go down the Ten Commandments and we ask, are these still in effect today? 9 out of the 10, we would say, sure, you shall have, we shouldn't have any other gods before God. We shouldn't make for ourselves an idol. But then we get to the commandment to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And we say, well, maybe not that one. The truth is most Christians don't celebrate the Sabbath day. I would encourage you, celebrate the Sabbath day first and foremost because we're commanded to do so. So do this to honor God. But then secondly, how do you keep the Sabbath day? Well, it's not just going to church on Sunday and coming home and twiddling your thumbs and being bored. How do you keep the Sabbath day? You live like a people who have been given rest based on God's glory. So rest in the joy of the Lord and do things or don't do things in order to remind yourself and symbolize to others that God has given you himself. He's present with you. He's given you work to do, and you enjoy the fruit of that work, and you rest in God and rest in such a way that you say, in God, by grace, enjoys being with me as his creature. And then you also do such in a way that reflects God's justification, that reflects God's deliverance. So we rest in such a way, our Sabbath rest should be a beacon. It should be a proclamation saying, I can rest in this way because I am redeemed. Israel rests in this way because they're redeemed through the Exodus. We understand that something greater than the Exodus has come. And so when we rest on the Sabbath day, it's a proclamation of the redemption that Christ has begun and is bringing through to its fulfillment in Revelation 21 when he returns, whenever he is going to dwell with us and we will dwell with him. We are a people who can rest in the work of God through Christ, who has given us rest and delivered us. So we celebrate Sabbath as a reminder of what God has done and what he is doing.